They ask why Africa still unsettles the world, why its symbols feel heavy, its memory persistent, its presence impossible to fully erase. What if the fear you were taught wasn't protection at all, but programming? And what if the story of creation doesn't begin where you were told it does? Tonight, the veil lifts over an ancient truth. The idea of evil was shaped, polished, and aimed, not to explain the world, but to rewrite Africa's place within it. Gods turned into demons, balance reframed as chaos, an origin too powerful to acknowledge quietly pushed into the shadows. This isn't just a myth or a forgotten legend. It's a spiritual architecture that still echoes through faith, politics, and identity today. Once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee how much of the modern world rests on what was deliberately left out. So listen closely. Not as a believer, not as a skeptic, but as a witness. Because remembering this changes how the past breathes in the present and how the future is claimed. If this revelation speaks to something ancient inside you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Some truths travel farther when they're shared. They say every great erasure starts with a simple question, the kind that makes powerful people uncomfortable. Long before maps had borders and scriptures had footnotes, Africa already carried stories about creation, balance, and the unseen. Not whispered, not hidden, lived. Funny thing is, history later pretended not to hear them, almost like silence was more convenient than truth. In those early ages, fear wasn't a monster lurking in the dark. It was a lesson, a signal, a teacher. But somewhere along the line, fear got repackaged, rebranded, turned into a weapon, and suddenly what once explained the universe was labeled dangerous. Isn't it ironic how quickly wisdom becomes a threat when it can't be controlled? Across ancient lands where stone temples met open skies, stories flowed through drums, firelight, and breath. Creation wasn't clean nor polite. It was raw, cyclical, alive. Life and death danced together without shame. Yet later, narratives insisted on separating them, as if balance itself were a crime. That separation didn't happen by accident. As centuries passed, certain voices decided that origins needed editing. Africa's role in the great beginning, too complex, too powerful, too inconvenient. So fear was slowly stitched into the story, teaching people to doubt what came before them. And once doubt took root, forgetting became easy. Still, beneath the dust of rewritten history, something stirs. The old stories never fully left. They waited, and as the question lingers in the air, another mystery begins to unfold, one that explains why fear had to be invented in the first place. Before fear was taught, Africa stood as a center of order, not chaos. Vast kingdoms rose along rivers that still breathe memory into the soil. Kemet by the Nile, Kush to the south, If glowing with sacred geometry. These weren't mythic backdrops. They were real places where astronomy, medicine, and spiritual law moved as one. Creation wasn't guessed. It was observed, measured, honored. Here, the universe wasn't ruled by blind chance or eternal punishment. It followed rhythm. Balance had a name, a weight, a responsibility. What later cultures would call divine law was already practiced through harmony with nature and the unseen. Funny how that part rarely makes it into the textbooks. Temples weren't built to escape the world, but to understand it. Stone aligned with stars. Water mirrored the sky. Priests weren't gatekeepers of fear, but interpreters of cycles, birth, decay, renewal. Nothing was evil by default. Everything had a role, even destruction, especially transformation. But such clarity carries a quiet danger. When a people know where they come from, they don't beg for permission to exist. They don't need saving, and that kind of self-awareness doesn't sit well with systems that thrive on obedience. So the ground was prepared, not with armies, not yet, but with ideas. And as Africa's ancient balance stood firm, unseen forces were already learning how to twist it, slowly, subtly, into something unrecognizable. At some point, the story took a sharp turn, and history calls it progress. Balance was suddenly framed as confusion, and complexity became suspicion. The old African understanding of existence, where opposing forces coexisted, didn't fit neatly into emerging doctrines that preferred clear villains and spotless heroes. Order apparently needed enemies. In this new version of reality, creation had to be simplified. Good stood on one side, evil on the other, with no room for the in-between. That middle space, the African space, was quietly erased. Funny how nuance is always the first casualty when power wants obedience. What had once been seen as necessary forces of change were now recast as threats. Transformation was no longer sacred. It was dangerous. Death wasn't a passage anymore, but a punishment. And fear, once a guide, was reshaped into a chain. The irony runs deep. The same cultures that borrowed African mathematics, symbols, and cosmology rejected the worldview that gave them meaning. They kept the tools, discarded the philosophy, and called it enlightenment. And as this divided vision spread across continents, it carried a hidden consequence, a growing need to explain where evil came from. That answer, slowly and deliberately, began pointing south. Once fear had a direction, it needed a face. Stories began to shift quietly at first, recasting African spiritual forces as something sinister. Deities tied to chaos, transition, and justice were no longer understood. They were accused. Funny how the guardians of thresholds always become suspects when doors are meant to stay closed. Figures that once governed balance were stripped of context. Their shadows were exaggerated, their lessons flattened. What had symbolized change, choice, and consequence was reframed as temptation or danger. It wasn't ignorance. It was editing, precise and intentional. Across retold myths, familiar archetypes appeared wearing new masks. Messengers became tricksters in the worst sense. Lords of transformation were recast as agents of destruction. And suddenly, entire spiritual systems were judged by fragments, not their wholeness. This reframing didn't just distort gods, it reshaped perception. If Africa's sacred forces were dangerous, then Africa itself could be feared. And fear, once planted, rarely stays symbolic for long. As these altered images spread beyond their origins, they crossed into sermons, laws, and moral codes. The transformation was nearly complete, but its consequences were only beginning to surface. Fear works best when it feels logical. Once spiritual symbols were distorted, the next step was simple. Teach people that fearing Africa was reasonable, that what came from its soil, its rituals, its memory, needed correction. Isn't it curious how control often disguises itself as protection? Slowly, fear became policy. It slipped into laws, sermons, and so-called moral frameworks, not shouted but repeated. Over time, repetition did the work violence couldn't. People began to police themselves, distancing their bodies and minds from anything labeled ancestral. The deeper irony is this. Those same systems quietly adopted African knowledge while publicly condemning its source. Astronomy, metallurgy, sacred geometry, borrowed, renamed, and sanitized. The wisdom stayed. The people were erased. Fear proved cheaper than armies and far more effective. When a culture doubts its own spiritual legitimacy, resistance fades, identity dissolves, and domination becomes almost invisible. But buried beneath centuries of instruction, something refused to disappear. A pulse, a memory, and as fear tightened its grip, that hidden current began preparing its return. Before chains ever touched skin, fear had already crossed the ocean. Long before ships arrived, the story was set. Africa was framed as something to escape from, not return to, and once that idea took hold, everything that followed could be justified. Funny how violence always needs a story to walk ahead of it. Spiritual invasion came first. Beliefs were labeled backward, rituals were mocked, and ancestral knowledge was reduced to superstition. It wasn't just land that was being targeted, but memory itself. When a people forget who they are, they stop questioning where they're being taken. The rewriting of identity didn't happen overnight. It unfolded through forced names, forbidden languages, and silenced ceremonies. What once connected the living to the dead was severed, replaced with fear of punishment instead of reverence for lineage. And still, fragments survived. In rhythms, in coded prayers, in gestures passed down without explanation. Even stripped of context, the spirit remembered what the mind was taught to forget. That quiet survival carried a consequence history didn't predict. Because what endures in silence eventually speaks, and when it does, it challenges everything built on forgetting. By the time the world called it colonization, the spiritual groundwork was already finished. Fear had done its job. Lands were taken, borders redrawn, and histories rewritten with confidence. After all, who would defend a civilization already labeled cursed or primitive? Irony has a sharp edge, and history wields it well. Sacred spaces were renamed ruins. Living traditions were archived as relics of a dead past. Africa was presented as a place frozen in time, while its knowledge quietly powered the modern world. Progress, it seemed, only moved forward after cutting its roots. The conflict wasn't just over territory, but over meaning. Symbols lost their original language. Masks became art objects. Rituals turned into performances. What once carried spiritual authority was reduced to aesthetics, admired but no longer listened to. Yet something resisted complete erasure. Elders remembered. Oral traditions bent but did not break. Stories adapted, hiding truth inside metaphor, waiting for safer ears. Survival, after all, is also a form of wisdom. And as the world marched forward, convinced the past was settled, the past kept breathing underneath. Because buried truths don't vanish. They wait for the right moment to rise again. Time moved on, but the lie needed maintenance. Museums rose where temples once stood, and glass cases replaced living altars. Sacred objects were labeled artifacts, stripped of voice, frozen under white lights. Funny how calling something ancient makes people forget it was once alive. Manuscripts vanished into private collections. Stones engraved with cosmology were dismissed as decoration. When evidence couldn't be destroyed, it was reframed, explained just enough to seem harmless, never enough to feel threatening. Knowledge doesn't have to be erased if it can be misunderstood. Archaeology, selective and cautious, told half stories. It confirmed dates, materials, measurements, but rarely meaning. Spirit was excluded, as if civilizations rose on stone alone. As if belief didn't shape law, science, and identity long before modern categories existed. Still, the earth kept secrets poorly. Buried cities surfaced. Symbols repeated themselves across continents. Patterns emerged that official narratives struggled to explain away. Coincidence became an overworked excuse. And with every discovery that didn't quite fit, pressure built, because when fragments start aligning, they point somewhere uncomfortable toward a shared origin that refuses to stay buried. As fragments resurfaced, comparisons grew unavoidable. Symbols carved in African stone echoed those found in Mesopotamia, traced again in the Americas, whispered through ancient Asia. Different names, same patterns. Funny how history calls that diffusion, never origin. Serpents, floods, sacred mountains, cosmic twins. The motifs traveled, but their roots were rarely acknowledged. Africa appeared in footnotes, never in headlines. The source became a suggestion, not a certainty, because certainty would raise uncomfortable questions. Texts once treated as isolated suddenly spoke to one another. Creation stories overlapped. Moral codes mirrored older African principles of balance and consequence. Yet official timelines insisted these similarities were coincidence, as if memory itself couldn't migrate with people. The irony deepened when later religions claimed universality while quietly inheriting African frameworks. Concepts of judgment, duality, and divine order were repackaged, sanitized, and declared new. Borrowing is easy when the lender is erased. And as these connections grew clearer, resistance hardened, because admitting a shared spiritual ancestry would collapse carefully built hierarchies and expose how much of the world still stands on African foundations. The narrative eventually went global. Fear was no longer local, cultural, or religious. It became systemic. Africa wasn't just misrepresented, it was positioned as the shadow against which the rest of the world defined itself. Civilization needed an opposite, and Africa was assigned the role without consent. This framing seeped into education, media, and politics. Darkness became metaphor, chaos became geography, and without saying it outright, the world learned who was meant to be trusted and who was meant to be feared. Strange how symbols can carry so much weight without ever naming what they imply. Power structures leaned heavily on this illusion. If Africa was chaos, then control looked like order. If its past was dangerous, then intervention felt justified. Fear turned exploitation into a moral duty, and few stopped to question the logic. Yet the story was never fully sealed. Even within systems built on distortion, cracks appeared. Art, resistance, and memory slipped through. The truth didn't shout. It murmured, waiting for listeners attuned to its frequency. And as those murmurs grew louder, a new tension formed. Because once fear loses its grip, something else takes its place. Remembrance. And remembrance changes everything. As remembrance stirred, it didn't arrive like a revolution. It came softly through rhythm and repetition. Drums spoke where words had been forbidden. Songs carried maps of memory across generations. Funny how sound travels farther than fear ever could. What survived did so by adapting. Spiritual codes hid inside music, movement, and story. Meanings layered themselves, visible only to those who knew how to listen. On the surface, it looked like culture. Beneath it, continuity pulsed. In places far from the continent, fragments reassembled themselves. Names changed, languages shifted, but patterns stayed loyal. Ancestors weren't forgotten, they were disguised. And disguise, it turns out, can be a form of protection. This quiet persistence unsettled the narrative of erasure, because something that survives trauma without permission carries power. Not loud power, enduring power, the kind that waits out empires. And as these hidden currents resurfaced into awareness, another question began forming, not about what was lost, but about what was never truly gone. In recent years, the ground itself has started telling stories again. DNA studies traced paths older than borders, pointing back to Africa with uncomfortable clarity. Funny how science eventually circles back to what ancestors already knew, just with better branding. Spiritual movements followed close behind. Symbols once mocked reappeared in art, fashion, and philosophy, not as nostalgia but as reclamation. People weren't searching for something new. They were remembering something ancient. This return unsettled long-standing assumptions. If Africa was always central, not peripheral, then history wasn't incomplete. It was edited, and edits, once exposed, demand accountability. What had been labeled myth began sounding suspiciously like memory. Rituals echoed psychology. Cosmology mirrored physics. The line between ancient wisdom and modern discovery grew thin, almost transparent. And as more people leaned into these rediscoveries, another realization surfaced quietly. If fear was constructed once, it could be dismantled too. The question was no longer whether the past mattered, but how much of the present depended on denying it. With fear slowly unraveling, identity stepped back into the light. Not as a trend, not as rebellion, but as recognition. People began asking different questions, not who taught us this, but who were we before we were taught to forget? That shift alone changed the ground beneath everything. Ancestral memory stopped being framed as backward and started sounding like inheritance. Lineage wasn't a burden anymore, it was a map, and maps, once rediscovered, tend to expose how far off course the journey went. This awakening carried spiritual weight. It challenged imposed hierarchies and borrowed truths. Because when a people reconnect with origin, authority loses its illusion. Power based on fear can't survive clarity for long. Of course, resistance followed. Every system reacts when its foundation shakes. Ancient knowledge was still dismissed as symbolic, emotional, unscientific, anything but legitimate. Funny how the goalposts always move when truth gets too close. Yet the return continued, quietly unstoppable. And as identity rooted itself deeper, the final layer of the old narrative began to crack. The belief that Africa's story belonged only to the past. The last illusion to fall was the idea of an ending. History had framed Africa as a beginning that failed, a story that faded so others could rise. But origins don't expire. They echo, and echoes have a way of returning when silence breaks. What was once buried under labels like primitive or myth began revealing its structure. Systems of thought, ethical frameworks, spiritual technologies, not folklore, foundations. Funny how the word ancient is often used to mean obsolete, never essential. This realization shifted the present. Politics, identity, spirituality all began to feel the pressure of unfinished truth. Because if Africa was central to creation, then exclusion was never neutral. It was deliberate, and deliberate choices leave fingerprints. The conflict now wasn't about the past, but about responsibility. What does the modern world do with a truth it was built to ignore? A truth that questions ownership, authorship, and authority all at once. And as that question hangs unresolved, another mystery opens, because recognizing the origin is only the first step. What comes next may be even more unsettling than what was erased. What remains now is the understanding of intention. Fear wasn't born from misunderstanding, it was designed. Layer by layer, story by story, a narrative was engineered to disconnect people from origin while appearing inevitable. Funny how systems always claim neutrality once they've finished shaping the outcome. This intention reshaped memory itself. Generations inherited conclusions without ever seeing the process. Africa wasn't debated, it was assumed. And assumptions, when repeated long enough, feel like facts. That's how absence becomes normal. Yet intention leaves patterns. The same exclusions, the same silences, the same discomfort whenever Africa is placed at the center instead of the margins. Because centering origin forces a reckoning with how much of the world was built on selective memory. Spiritually, this moment carries weight, not revelation as spectacle, but as responsibility. Knowing the truth doesn't restore what was taken, but it changes how power is recognized, questioned, and reclaimed. And as this awareness settles in, one final door begins to open. Because once fear is exposed as a construct, something older steps forward, waiting to be heard in its own voice again. What steps forward now isn't rage or revenge, it's memory with patience, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it knows it outlasts noise. Africa's legacy begins to speak again, not as a defense, but as a presence that never truly left. Funny how truth feels calm once fear stops narrating. This return doesn't arrive wrapped in certainty. It comes as fragments aligning, stories matching symbols, symbols matching land, land matching bloodlines. Nothing forced, Nothing rushed, just recognition unfolding at its own pace. Spiritually, this moment feels like standing at a threshold, not between good and evil, but between forgetting and remembering. The old systems sense it too. You can tell by how quickly they dismiss what they can't fully contain. What's emerging challenges more than history books. It questions identity itself. Who gets to define origin, meaning, and authority? And once those questions are asked, they don't politely go away. So the path continues forward, unfinished, and intentionally so. Because the deeper the memory goes, the more it reveals. And the next layer waiting beneath the surface carries a truth even harder to ignore.